Hey there, I'm Ryan Boehme, and you're tuning into So You Want to Teach Percussion. This video series is designed particularly for my current Percussion Methods students. Since they aren't able to have a typical Percussion Methods experience due to the current global pandemic, these videos are designed to give them a foundation of the technique outside of class time so that we have more time to play when we're together. But I also hope this video series can be helpful to any music educators out there. Today, we're talking about timpani. Timpani is actually one of my favorite instruments. You get to play a bunch of huge drums, and you get to control the pitch for each one. But timpani can be so revealing and temperamental that beginning percussionists can be a little intimidated by them. Learning the ins and outs of timpani takes some patience, but once your students get the hang of all the fundamental techniques involved, it's actually a very satisfying instrument to play. In this video, we're going to cover all the concepts your students need to know before they kick off their timpani tenure. We're going to look at playing position and playing technique. It's time to put the pedal to the kettle. First, we're going to talk about playing position. As usual, we want to feel really good and really relaxed when we play any percussion instrument. That's especially important for timpani, where you're playing up to 5 drums at one time. But don't worry. Finding an ergonomic way of maneuvering timpani is pretty easy. Throughout this video, I'm going to be using a stool. Having a stool is useful for when I need to adjust the pitch of the drums, since I'm able to easily move my feet to the pedals. Also, since timpani aren't the tallest drums out there, and they're not exactly height adjustable, a stool can help accommodate your shorter and taller students. A generic wooden stool should work fine for your students, but you may also consider investing in a timpani-specific stool, such as the one I'm using here. Many timpani-specific stools are height adjustable, unlike wooden stools. That makes these stools accessible to more students of varying heights. With or without a stool, you'll want to position the drums in such a way that you can comfortably reach each pedal without having to move too far, and you'll want to be able to access the proper playing zone for each drum, which is going to be 3 to 4 inches away from the rim of each drum. Timpani heads are very similar to bass drum heads. When you play right in the center, you're going to get an articulate sound with little resonance. If you play right on the edge, you'll get a lot of resonance and very little attack. For timpani, playing in that range 3 to 4 inches away from the rim is going to let each drum speak fully without sounding too punchy or shallow. With that being said, you'll want to make sure you can access each playing zone comfortably, keeping the elbows in line with your torso. If you're using a stool, you may find that you need to lean back a bit in order to reach the highest and lowest drums at the same time. So in general, you want your students to feel really comfortable and relaxed before they even start playing timpani. If you have students that have to slouch over to play or reach up to play, then you're going to want to invest in a stool of some kind. Check out Fundamental Technique Part 1, where I go over a ton of posture mistakes that your students are going to want to avoid. Now, we're going to talk about playing technique. Despite their immense size, timpani are actually very delicate instruments that really illuminate your students' technique. If your students approach timpani like snare drum, with a focus on downward velocity, they're going to sound something like bow, 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 bow. Okay, that might be a slight exaggeration, but as you can see in this clip where I'm downstroking the mallet on the drum, I run the risk of getting a very saturated front to the note, a sound that some timpanists refer to as a bark. With timpani, we have to think differently about our playing. Rather than thinking about how we're striking the drum, it helps instead to think about how the mallet is leaving the drum. This might sound a little philosophical, but stay with me here. You have to pay attention to the lift of the mallet. Specifically, you want to notice the speed of the lift. I'll demonstrate with single notes. With a slow lift of the mallet, I can achieve a soft, warm articulation. A fast lift, on the other hand, is going to give me a heavier articulation. And a medium lift is going to allow me to achieve an articulation that's somewhere in between. So it's like you're pulling the sound out of the drum, rather than just smacking it. With this mindset, your students are going to make more consistent, desirable sounds. There are a lot of right sounds that your students can make, but it's also easy to let some wrong sounds accidentally slip in. To make the right sounds a little easier to achieve, many timpanists use the grip you saw me using in those clips, which is called French grip. Unlike the grip we learned for snare drum, where the thumb is almost pointing parallel to the ground, the thumb's going to be pointing upwards now. With empty hands, hold your hands out so that your thumbs are facing the sky. Then bring your palms together, Finally, push your elbows slightly away from your body so your forearms are more in line. From this position, you're going to rotate the forearms so that your hands kind of move like this. Kind of like you're giving a really weird wave at the end of your Zoom meeting. It can feel a little weird at first, but once you get the hang of it, it can be really useful in controlling the lift of the mallet.
But Mr. Boehme, do we have to use French grip to play the Timpanis?
Well, generic percussion student, you don't have to. If you can achieve the techniques and sounds in this video with German grip or American grip, then you can stick with those if you're more comfortable. You'll notice that even my grip isn't totally French. It's a little more like this. But it's still useful to know the benefits of French grip, especially on timpani. Okay, let's get back to playing drums. Knowing that timpani are very revealing, students are going to have to plan out their sticking choices moving between drums. In this clip, I'm playing 3 notes on each drum. At first, it might make sense to assign one hand to each drum, but at this speed, it's difficult to get an appropriate, consistent sound for each note. If I play this with alternating sticking instead, the notes are immediately more clear, since each mallet has more time between the lift of one note and the preparation for the next note. That pretty much covers single notes, so now it's time to talk about rolls. These can be notated a few different ways in timpani parts. Some composers use a trill marking over the note, and other composers will just use 3 or more tremolos. Without going into too much detail, these markings mean the same thing about 95% of the time. Your students are going to use single stroke rolls for all timpani rolls, but with timpani rolls, our goal is to sustain the sound of the drum. In other words, we're less focused on getting a digga 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 sound, and more focused on just helping the drums sing. That means we still have to pay attention to the lift of each note, so we can avoid sounding too articulate. You also have to pay attention to your hand speed, and since you're dealing with drums of different sizes, with different amounts of tension on each head, you're going to have to adjust your hand speed for rolls on each drum, so you can avoid undesirable sounds. For instance, if I roll too slowly on the 23-inch timpano, since it's the smallest drum and has the most tension on the head, it's going to sound more like I'm playing a rhythm. So I'm going to have to find a speed where my roll sounds less like a rhythm and more like a sustained pitch. Conversely, if I roll too fast on bigger drums, like this 32-inch timpano, my sound is going to be either muddy or barky. Since there's less tension on the head for larger drums, I can play a slower roll, which actually helps me sound less articulate in this case. To summarize, your students will generally need to roll slower on larger drums and faster on smaller drums. Notice the slight bump in hand speed. Hand speed is an important factor, but even when your students have that figured out, you'll still be able to hear any inconsistent notes within the roll. Making every single note of a roll consistent definitely takes practice, but here's a really useful method for working on that. In this clip, I've draped towels over the heads, cutting out most of the resonance of each drum and allowing me to focus on articulation. If you listen to this clip closely, you can hear that my right hand is a little bit louder than my left. Even that slight difference in dynamic between the hands can easily be heard with the towel on the head. Your students are going to want to strive more for this sound, where it sounds like a consistent digga digga digga. Then, when the towel's off the head, the drum can sing smoothly without any inconsistencies.
But Mr. Boomerang, what if I have to play dynamics?
To play different dynamics, you're going to adjust your mallet height and your hand speed, and you have to listen to the drums. We're still aiming to get a nice sustained sound without any barking or muddiness. In this clip, I'll play some crescendo rolls. I'm going to start with a lower mallet height, closer to the head, and a slightly slower hand speed. With low velocity in mind, it's easy to not sound too articulate here. As I start the crescendo, I'm going to gradually speed up my hands, staying relaxed, and rotate the wrists a little more for each note so that the mallet height increases. If I get carried away with the crescendo and stop paying attention to my relaxed grip and low velocity, the drums are going to start sounding very bow, 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 bow. Now if I'm playing a decrescendo roll, I'm going to reverse the process, starting with a faster hand speed and higher mallet height. As the decrescendo continues, I'm going to reduce my hand speed and mallet height gradually, eventually ending with my mallet heads very close to the head. Composers love to write forte piano crescendo rolls for timpani. To get the most out of this effect, you want your students to start with a single forte note, wait about 1 second, and then continue with the usual crescendo roll method. This gives the resonance some time to fade out before the actual roll starts. and it allows the quiet start of the roll to be even sneakier. If your students play forte piano crescendo rolls like this instead, where they're constantly rolling the whole time, it probably won't sound horrible. But if you listen closely, you lose that really soft dynamic end, since you aren't allowing the sound to dissipate before you start the roll. So we know about starting sound when we're playing timpani, but what about controlling the duration of the sound? Composers often want certain notes to sound for a specified amount of time, probably to match the context of the rest of the ensemble. To make that happen, we're going to look at muffling. Here's the basic muffling process in slow motion. Similarly to what I discussed in the crash cymbals episode, your students want to hit 3 key checkpoints here. The initial stroke, then the muffle, then the reset of the playing position. Having a solid initial stroke means we're still allowing the mallet to lift off of the head. Notice the rotation of the hand between the first and second checkpoints, and how close the hand stays to the drum head. If you see your students doing something like this, where they're downstroking before they muffle, that's going to lead to barky and undesirable sounds before the muffle. We don't want to change our approach to the initial stroke. For the second checkpoint, I'm just tucking the mallet into my hand so that I can muffle with as many fingers as possible, spreading the fingertips out so I can cover more surface area. If I only use a few fingers to muffle, it's harder to cut out all of the frequencies. Adding more fingers allows me to reduce the pressure of my hand pushing into the head. Since we're here after the second checkpoint, getting to the third checkpoint comfortably takes a little bit of practice. Your students may want to practice this transition by itself, making sure they can comfortably get from here to here. You probably noticed in those clips that even after I muffled the drum that I was playing, there's still some audible resonance. This is the result of sympathetic vibrations, and it's something that all of your students will encounter at some point in their timpani journey. I have the drums tuned in an F major triad. The heads are very sensitive and they vibrate a lot. So when I play the C, it's going to activate the second harmonic on the F drum, which is also a C. So after I muffle the C drum, you can still hear some C ringing sympathetically from the 32-inch drum. Your students don't have to know about the harmonic series. You just want them to know that sympathetic vibrations are something to be aware of, and they can even happen as a result of other ensemble members playing a note that tickles the overtones of one of the drums. So if I'm muffling the C with this tuning scheme, I would actually need to muffle the 26 and the 32 just to cut out all the resonance. Your students will most likely notice these spots themselves in their timpani parts, and they'll probably go ahead and adjust their muffling accordingly, even if they don't know the exact cause of the sympathetic vibrations. Getting back to muffling, your students are also going to want to be comfortable muffling with both hands. Here are some examples where I would want to use both hands to muffle. In this clip, I'm playing the 32-inch and the 26-inch drums in succession, so trying to use one hand to play and the other hand to muffle is not going to be the most efficient method. Instead, I would do something like this, where I keep my right hand on the 26-inch and my left hand on the 32-inch. Now I can keep my body in one spot, which is especially useful if I'm reading music while I'm muffling. But what if you want each note to sound until the next note, like this example? In this case, I still keep the hands on separate drums, but I'm going to have to time my muffle on one hand so that it lines up with the note on the other hand. This is a lot like a double stop, which we learned on snare drum, but this does take some practice to get the coordination and the timing down. And finally, if I'm muffling 2 notes at the same time, I'm going to have to make sure my hands make contact with the drums simultaneously, which cuts out the sound of each drum at the same time. So there's definitely a lot of skills to develop when it comes to playing technique. But as long as your students are listening closely to the drums, and you're giving them your perspective from what you hear on the podium, they'll be on their way to making some really great sounds in no time. I hope this video gave you a thorough introduction to playing timpani. In part 2, we'll cover timpani tuning and mallet choice. Until then, I'm Ryan Boehme, and thanks for tuning in to So You Want to Teach Percussion.